The morning Jedediah Whitfield rode onto the Bancroft property, the sun was barely a bruise on the eastern horizon, and Winifred Bancroft was already knee-deep in a ditch she had dug herself, trying to coax water from a crumbling irrigation channel that her father had built 17 years ago with his own 2 hands. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she straightened up slow, pushing a strand of dark auburn hair back from her face with the back of a dirty glove, leaving a smear of red Kansas soil across her cheekbone like a war mark. She was 26 years old, lean and sun-browned and strong in the way that women who have worked land alone for 2 years get strong, and she looked at the man riding toward her with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that strangers arriving before breakfast rarely bring good news. He was tall in the saddle, that much she could tell even at a distance. He rode a good horse, a bay gelding with clean legs and an easy stride, and he wore a plain brown duster that had seen real weather, not the kind of coat a man buys to look the part. He pulled up about 30 feet from the ditch and took off his hat, which surprised her, because men who came to take things from her never bothered with manners. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, not loud the way men who are unsure of themselves make their voices loud. "I am looking for a Miss Winifred Bancroft." "You found her," she said, and she did not climb out of the ditch. There was a certain advantage in staying where she was. "What is it you want, Mr. Whitfield?" he said. "Jedediah Whitfield. I represent the Consolidated Land and Grazing Company out of Dodge City." He paused and reached into his duster, and she tensed, but he only pulled out a folded paper. "I have been authorized to make an offer on the Bancroft tract. 40 acres, the eastern parcel, which I understand is the last remaining piece of the original homestead." There it was. She had known this day was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the air turns heavy and the birds go quiet. She had sold the western 40 to pay her father's medical debts when he got sick. She had sold the southern pasture when the wheat failed in 1877. She had sold the timber rights to the North Ridge when the roof caved in that winter. And now she was down to this last 40 acres, this stubborn strip of Kansas earth that she had promised herself and her dead father she would not give up, not while there was breath in her body and strength in her arms. "It is not for sale," she said. Jedediah Whitfield did not look surprised. He folded the paper back up and tucked it into his duster with the same unhurried precision with which he had drawn it out. "Miss Bancroft, I was told you might say that. I was also told to inform you that Consolidated holds a lien on this property that your father took out in the spring of 1876, and that lien comes due at the end of this month." She knew about the lien. She had been trying to forget about it for 6 months. "I am aware of the lien," she said, keeping her voice steady through an act of will that cost her more than she would ever admit to a stranger. "Then you understand that if you cannot service the debt, the property transfers regardless of your wishes." He said it plainly, not cruelly, but plainly, the way a man says a thing he does not enjoy saying, but says it anyway because honesty matters more than comfort. She climbed out of the ditch then, because she was not going to have this conversation looking up at him. She pulled off her work gloves and slapped them against her thigh and walked toward him, and she did not stop until she was close enough to see his face clearly. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or 2 more, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had a week's worth of beard on it and gray eyes that were watching her with something she had not expected to find there. Not triumph, not impatience, something almost like apology. "How much time do I have?" she asked. 31 days, he said. "Miss Bancroft, I want you to understand that my coming here today was not intended as a threat. Consolidated sent me ahead of the legal men precisely because I asked them to. I thought it was better if you heard this from a person rather than from a writ." She studied him for a long moment. "That was considerate of you," she said finally, and she was not being sarcastic, which seemed to surprise him. "I can come back," he said, "if you need time to think." "Come back for what purpose?" she asked. "To collect my answer or to collect my land?" "Just to talk," he said, "if that suits you." It did not suit her. Nothing about this suited her. But she found herself saying, "There is coffee on the stove if you want it. The house is through those cottonwoods," and she walked away before she could question her own judgment. The farmhouse was small, but it was proud, the kind of house that had been kept up through sheer determination rather than resources. The porch was swept. The windows were clean. There were curtains made from flour sacking that had been dyed a deep blue with indigo, and they had been ironed. Jedediah Whitfield noticed these things as he tied his horse at the rail and followed her up the porch steps. He noticed because he had been to a lot of failing farms in his work for Consolidated, and most of them had stopped trying some time before the end. This woman had not stopped trying. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something sweet, dried apple rings strung on a cord above the window. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered blue enamel pot and set one in front of him without asking how he took it, because out here nobody asked. He sat at her table and looked at the walls, which were covered in a careful hand-drawn map of the property. Not a surveyor's map, but a working farmer's map, with notations about which soil was clay and which was loam, where the water table sat, where the old drainage channels ran. There were sketches of planting layouts in the margins, ambitious and detailed and clearly well thought out. "You drew these?" he asked. She sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup. "My father started them. I have been adding to them." She followed his gaze to the walls. 40 acres is not nothing if you farm it right. That is the problem. People around here look at 40 acres and they think it is a finished story. But it is good soil. It is some of the best soil in Barton County, and it sits on top of an underground water source that nobody has bothered to tap properly. If the East Channel were rebuilt and the field rotated correctly, this land could produce enough wheat and corn to carry a family and then some. He was quiet for a moment. "You have done all this work," he said, meaning the maps, the ditch, the calculations in the margins. "I have done all this work," she confirmed. "And you are working the land alone." "My father died in February of last year," she said. "He left me the land and the debt and 3 good tools and a milk cow that died in October." She said it without self-pity as a statement of fact which somehow made it worse to hear. "I have a neighbor, Amos Decker, who helps when he can, but he has his own land to work. I manage." Jedediah looked down at his coffee. He had purchased land for Consolidated for 3 years. He had been good at it, which meant he was good at persuading people to sell things they did not want to sell, and he had told himself that he was doing them a favor, getting them out from under debts they could not carry. But sitting in this kitchen, looking at these walls, listening to this woman who had dug her own irrigation ditch before the sun was fully up, he found the usual arguments drying up in his throat like water in a drought. "What would it take," he asked, "to service the lien?" She looked at him sharply. "Why?" "Curiosity," he said, and then, because that was not honest enough, he added, "Because those maps tell me something worth paying attention to, and because I am not sure Consolidated has fully considered what they would be acquiring if this property came to them." She watched him the way you watch a sky that might be fixing to do something unexpected. "The lien is $240, she said, "plus the interest that has accrued, which brings it to somewhere just over $300. I have $64 in a tin under the floorboard, and a standing crop of winter wheat that might, if it does not get blown out, bring me $80 at harvest in June, which is still 2 months away and leaves me $160 short even in the best case. $300. He could write a draft for $300 out of his own account and not feel it. He had done well enough working for Consolidated to have savings, and he lived simply. The thought arrived before he had any intention of forming it, and it startled him. "Miss Bancroft," he said carefully, "I am going to be honest with you about something." "Please do," she said, and she meant it. Plain speaking was a thing she respected above most other things. "I came here expecting to close a land purchase. That is what I was sent to do, and normally I am fairly good at it." But I have been sitting in this kitchen for 20 minutes and I have looked at those maps and I have watched you talk about this land, and I do not think I can in good conscience complete the transaction Consolidated sent me to complete." He paused. "That is going to cost me something with my employer. I want you to know I understand that." The silence in the kitchen was the kind you could feel against your skin. "You are not going to try to buy my land," she said slowly. "No," he said. "Not today." He stood up and set his hat on his head. "I am going to ride back to town and think about what, if anything, can be done about your situation from the other end. I cannot promise anything, but I am going to think about it." She stood up too, and she was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something between suspicion and something else she had not decided to show yet. "Why?" she asked again. "You do not know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know good land and I know a hard worker, and those two things together ought not to be taken apart if there is any other way." He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands. "Your coffee is very good, Miss Bancroft." She almost smiled. It was the almost that caught him, the way the corner of her mouth moved and then stopped, the way she thought better of letting herself smile at a stranger who had arrived to buy her last 40 acres. He thought about that almost smile all the way back to town. The town of Larkspur, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, was a rough-edged place that was trying to decide what it wanted to be. The railroad had come through 2 years earlier and brought commerce and a certain amount of ambition. And now there were 2 dry goods stores and a proper hotel with a dining room and a newspaper that printed twice a week and sometimes got the news right. There was also a saloon, a livery, a sheriff's office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a land office that served as the local representative of several larger Eastern-backed land companies, including Consolidated. Jedediah had a room at the hotel and an office on loan from the land office manager, a thin, nervous man named Garfield Prout, who did not understand why Jedediah had come back from the Bancroft property without a signed agreement, and said so repeatedly, and with increasing agitation over the course of the afternoon. "The woman has nowhere to go," Prout said, spreading his hands on the desk. "The lien is legally sound. It transfers in 31 days. You do not need her cooperation, Whitfield. You just need her to be out of the way." "The lien transfers the debt," Jedediah said evenly. "It does not necessarily transfer the land itself as free and clear as Consolidated believes, because I spent this afternoon at the county recorder's office, and I found something interesting." He set a copied document on the desk. "The original homestead grant from 1861 has a proviso that the land cannot be transferred by debt instrument to a corporate entity within 50 years of the original grant, only to an individual buyer or to the original grantee's direct heirs. Thomas Bancroft took that land grant in 1861, and his daughter is his direct heir, and that proviso is still in effect." Prout stared at the document. "That cannot be right." "It is right," Jedediah said. "You should have caught it before you wrote the lien, frankly. Consolidated's lawyers in Dodge City missed it too, apparently. Which means that what Consolidated actually owns, if the debt is not serviced, is the debt. They own $300 of debt. They cannot take possession of the land under the terms of the original grant without the voluntary agreement of the heir." Prout was quiet for a moment. "She does not know this," he said. "No," said Jedediah, "she does not." "Then we need not tell her." Jedediah looked at him for a long moment. "I need to ride back out there tomorrow," he said, "and I need to tell her." He did not sleep well that night. He lay on the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman standing in a ditch in the gray morning light, talking about soil and water tables with the passion of someone who loves a thing so completely that it has become part of the architecture of who they are. He thought about the maps on her walls. He thought about the almost smile. He rode out to the Bancroft place the next morning with a copy of the homestead grant proviso folded in his breast pocket, and a sense of purpose that felt different from the kind of purpose he was usually paid to exercise. He found her not in a ditch this time, but up on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles with an unhurried competence that made him stop his horse and simply watch for a moment before she noticed him. Whitfield, she said, not climbing down. Miss Bancroft, he said. I have some information for you that I think you will find relevant to your situation. She studied him from the roof. Good information or bad information? Good, he said. Mostly good. She came down then, hand over hand down the ladder with the ease of someone who has done it 1,000 times, and she stood in the barnyard and listened while he explained the homestead grant proviso. He watched her face as she understood what it meant, watched the tight line around her eyes ease slightly, watched something that might have been hope move behind her expression like sunlight behind cloud. They cannot take it, she said when he finished. Not against your will, he confirmed. Not under the terms of the original grant. They can pursue the debt through other means, garnishment of any future income from the land, but they cannot dispossess you. Lien was written incorrectly and Consolidated does not know it yet. But you know it, she said, and you work for Consolidated. I work for Consolidated, he said. That is correct. So why are you telling me this? The question sat between them in the morning air, and he answered it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer things. Because it is the right thing to do, he said, and because I am finding it difficult to be on the wrong side of something. She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the wheat field. That bright liquid song that sounded like the prairie itself was trying to say something hopeful. What will happen to you with Consolidated when they find out? I imagine they will let me go, he said. I am not overly worried about it. You should be, she said. A man needs to work. There is always work, he said. There is not always the ability to look yourself in the face. He said it simply, without drama, and she believed him. She looked at the barn roof, at the pile of new shingles she had not yet finished laying. The debt is still real, she said. Even if they cannot take the land, $300 does not disappear. No, he agreed, it does not. The wheat crop will cover some of it. If I can get the East Channel working before the spring rains stop, I might be able to put in a second planting of corn, which would give me another harvest in late summer. If both crops do well, I could have the debt cleared by September. That is a reasonable plan, he said. The problem is the East Channel, she said. I have been working on it alone, and it is more than one person can finish before the planting window closes. She said this last part carefully, not as a request, just as a statement of the obstacle. I could help, he said. She turned to look at him fully. You are a land buyer for a Dodge City company, she said. You do not strike me as a man who digs irrigation channels. I grew up on a farm in Missouri, he said. I know how to work. Another silence. The meadowlark sang again. I cannot pay you, she said. I did not ask to be paid, he said. She pulled on her work gloves. Well then, she said, and she turned toward the east field, and after a moment he tied his horse and followed her. They worked that day until the light gave out. Winifred had been right that the channel was more than one person could manage alone, but with two people it became possible. Not easy, but possible. The old channel had been built by her father using a combination of stone and packed clay, and it had partially collapsed in 3 places where the winter frost had heaved the ground. They worked in companionable silence for the most part, and when they did talk, it was the practical talk of people working toward the same goal, with an occasional comment or question that was about something else entirely. She told him about her father, Thomas Bancroft, who had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1860 with her mother and a wagon full of hope, and had built this homestead from ground level over nearly 20 years. Her mother had died of fever when Winifred was 9, and after that it had been just the two of them, father and daughter, and the land. She had learned everything from him, how to read soil and weather and the moods of growing things, and when he got sick the previous winter, she had been with him every day, and when he died she had buried him under the old cottonwood by the creek and had gone back to work because that was what he would have wanted, and also because working was the only way she knew how to carry grief. Jedediah listened to all of this and said little, but what he said he meant. He had that kind of listening that is actually rare, the kind where the person is fully present and not merely waiting for their turn to speak, and Winifred noticed it in the way you notice something you have been missing without knowing you were missing it. He told her in turn, in fragments over the course of the afternoon, about his own history. He had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, on a farm that had been caught between Union and Confederate sympathies during the war, and had ended up burned by one side or the other. Nobody was ever quite sure which. His father had rebuilt afterward, but the spirit had gone out of the land or maybe out of the man, and Jedediah had left at 20, intending to go west and find something that was his own. He had drifted for a while, working cattle drives and doing various odd jobs, before a natural facility with numbers and a reputation for straight dealing had landed him in Dodge City working for Consolidated. It had seemed like a good arrangement at the time. He was less sure about that now. By the end of the day, they had repaired 2 of the 3 breaks in the channel, and the water was running clear through the first section, and Winifred stood at the edge of the field and watched it with an expression that Jedediah stored away in his memory like something worth keeping. She fed him supper, a proper meal of salt pork and beans and cornbread, and they sat at the same kitchen table where she had given him coffee the previous morning, and the light from the oil lamp was warm, and the conversation moved easily between them in the way that conversation moves between people who have found a frequency they share. "You should not have told me about the proviso," she said, not accusingly, just as an observation. "I know," he said, "most men in your position would not have." "I know that too." She pulled apart a piece of cornbread and looked at it. "What will you do now, after Consolidated lets you go?" "I have been thinking about that," he said honestly. "There is land to be had here in Barton County. A man with a little saved money and a willingness to work could establish something." He said it neutrally, not looking at her. "A lot of men have thought that," she said. "Fewer have followed through. I have finished things before," he said. She looked up at him then and found him already looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the lamp between them flickered slightly in a draught from under the door, and the moment was the kind that does not announce itself, but that you know, even while it is happening, that you will remember it. He rode back to town in the dark, which was not wise and he knew it, but he wanted to think, and thinking on horseback in the open air under a Kansas sky had always worked better for him than thinking in a box of a hotel room. The stars over the prairie in 1878 were extraordinary, thick and cold and ancient, and he rode under them and thought about a woman with mud on her cheekbone and maps on her walls, and a voice that told the truth without apology. The next morning, he rode to the Consolidated office in town and sent a telegraph to Dodge City informing the company of the homestead grant proviso and his recommendation that they consult their lawyers before proceeding with the Bancroft acquisition. He sent a second telegraph resigning his position effective immediately. Garfield Prout heard about the second telegraph within the hour and came to the hotel in a state of barely controlled outrage. "You have lost your mind, Whitfield," he said. "Possibly," said Jedediah, and he was not particularly troubled by the possibility. "Consolidated will pursue the debt aggressively now. They will make things very difficult for that woman. They will find that the legal avenue is considerably narrower than they thought," said Jedediah, "and I expect their lawyers will advise them that the cost of pursuing a $300 debt through the courts against a valid homestead grant proviso is not worth the candle." He had spent the previous evening writing a careful legal summary of the proviso's implications, which he had already sent to the county recorder and to the state land office in Topeka for their records. He had made it difficult for the situation to be quietly buried, which was the best protection he could offer her. He went back to the Bancroft place that morning and found her working on the 3rd break in the channel, ankle deep in cold water and perfectly focused. "You are back," she said. "I told you I would come back to work," he said. "I thought you might have thought better of it." "I have never been very good at thinking better of things," he said, and he pulled off his coat and rolled up his sleeves and stepped into the water beside her. They finished the 3rd break by noon, and when they opened the sluice gate, the water ran through the entire length of the East Channel for the first time in what Winifred said was probably 4 years. She watched the water move, and she pressed her lips together very tightly, and Jedediah looked away and gave her that moment in private, the way a person gives another person privacy for things that matter deeply. That afternoon, they turned to the field itself. The east field had been lying fallow for 2 seasons, which was not the worst thing for the soil, but which had allowed a stubborn tangle of prairie grass and thistle to establish itself, and it needed to be broken before planting. Jedediah had arranged to rent a horse team and a plow from the livery for the week, and with 2 people trading off on the plow handles, they broke the field in 2 days. Those 2 days were the days when things shifted between them in a way that both of them noticed, and neither of them addressed directly. The way you notice a change in the weather not when it happens, but when you realize it has been different for a while. They talked about everything, farming and weather and books, and the state of the country, and the way the railroads were changing the West in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes not, and the way the land was being parceled and sold and bought and resold, and how something was being lost in that process, even as other things were being gained. They argued, pleasantly but genuinely, about the merits of winter versus spring wheat, and about whether Kansas would ever become a proper state in spirit as well as name, and about whether the future belonged to the farms or to the towns. Winifred had opinions, and she stated them clearly and without apology, and Jedediah, who had spent 3 years around men who mostly talked past each other, found this so refreshing that it took an actual effort of will not to simply stare at her while she spoke. On the second evening of plowing, when they were cleaning the plow blade together in the last of the daylight, she said suddenly and without context, "What do you see when you look at this land?" He considered the question seriously. "I see 40 acres of some of the best soil in the county," he said. "I see a working water system that is better than anything on the neighboring properties. I see a farmhouse that has been maintained with care. I see a wheat crop that is coming in strong and a field that is ready to plant." He paused. "And I see everything that you have put into it, which does not show up on any survey but which is present in every corner of the place." She was quiet for a long time. The sun was going down, and the sky was doing everything that Kansas skies do when the sun goes down, every shade of orange and pink and deep violet in an arrangement so extravagant it almost seemed like a show-off. "My father believed in this land absolutely," she said. "He believed that if you treated the earth well, it would treat you well in return. He used to say that farming was a conversation, that you had to listen as much as you talked." She ran her hand along the plow blade. "I believe that too, but it is hard to have a conversation when you are the only one speaking." He put his hand over hers on the plow blade just briefly, and she did not pull away. "You are not the only one speaking now," he said, and he meant more than the farming. The color that came into her face was not the color of the sunset, though it competed with it. She looked at their hands, and then she looked at him, and the look she gave him was direct and complicated and entirely honest. "You are a careful man," she said slowly. "But you are moving in a direction." "Yes," he said, "I am." He took his hand away. "I wanted to say it plainly so there is no confusion about my intentions." "What are your intentions, Mr. Whitfield?" "Jedediah," he said, "if that is all right." A slow breath. "Jedediah," she said, and his name in her voice was a different word than it had ever been before. "What are your intentions?" "I would like to stay," he said. "In the county, I mean. I have been thinking of purchasing a piece of land myself. The 60-acre parcel on the north side of the Larkspur Road came up for sale last week, and the price is fair. It is good land, and it is adjacent to yours." He paused. "I am not asking for anything that is not offered freely. But I want you to know that I did not come back here 3 mornings in a row because I work for Consolidated, because I no longer work for Consolidated. I came back because of entirely different reasons." She looked at the sky, at the extravagant sunset, at the field they had plowed together. "You are a strange man," she said finally. "I have been told that," he said. "I mean it kindly," she said. And then, very quietly, "I am glad you came back." The planting of the corn was the most important thing, and they did it together over 3 days in the second week of May, moving down the rows in the warm spring air with the easy rhythm of shared work. Winifred's neighbor, Amos Decker, came by on the second day and found them working side by side and gave Jedediah a long measuring look before apparently deciding he was satisfactory, because after that he helped too, the three of them moving through the field at a pace that felt almost like abundance after the long solitude of the work. Amos was in his 50s, a weathered and kind-hearted widower who had been keeping an eye on Winifred since her father died, bringing venison in the winter and fixing things she could not fix alone, and generally standing as a kind of quiet guardian. He and Jedediah took each other's measure over 2 days of shared work, and arrived at a mutual respect that was sealed, as these things often are in the West, not with words, but with the simple evidence of how each man worked. "He is not wrong for this land," Amos told Winifred on the evening of the second day, jerking his head toward Jedediah, who was tying back a fence gate at the east edge of the field. "I did not ask your opinion," she said. "No," said Amos contentedly, "but I gave it anyway." Jedediah had ridden to the county land office on the 4th day and put down a deposit on the 60-acre parcel north of the road, using the money he had saved during his years with Consolidated. He told Winifred about it the same evening, sitting on her porch after the planting was done, in that warm blue hour between sunset and dark when the air smells like turned earth and new growth, and the first fireflies begin their tentative negotiation with the darkness. "You actually did it," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "You have been telling me things and then doing them," she said. "It is an unusual quality." "I hope it is not so unusual that it seems suspicious," he said. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the contained almost smile, but actual laughter, low and warm and startled, as if it surprised her too. The sound of it did something very specific to his chest. "I have decided that you are not suspicious," she said. "I have decided that you are simply reliable." "I will take reliable," he said. They sat in the blue quiet and listened to the frogs beginning in the creek bottom and the nighthawks calling in the upper air. The fireflies came out one by one and then many at once, the way things that have been waiting do all at once when the conditions are finally right. "Jedediah," she said. "Yes." "What was it like, riding for Consolidated, going to people's properties and buying the things they did not want to sell?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "It was easier at first," he said. "When I was younger, I could tell myself that the land was just land and the work was just work, and that the people involved were making rational decisions in difficult circumstances. That is not entirely wrong." He paused. "But over time you accumulate the faces, the people you sat across a table from, and you find that you cannot stop seeing them. Is that why you quit?" "You are why I quit," he said simply. Another silence, and this one had a different quality than the earlier silences, fuller, more charged, the way the air gets before a storm, except that this was not threatening. "I did not ask you to do that," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "You did not. That is part of why it matters." He turned to look at her in the blue light, and she was already looking at him. "I want to be straightforward with you, Winifred. I have been on my own for a long time, and I have been content with that for most of it, but I find that contentment is receding at a rate that I cannot ignore." He paused. "I would like to know you better, if that is a thing you would consider." The night sounds continued around them, the frogs and the nighthawks and the wind in the cottonwood by the creek, and Winifred sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at the fireflies in the field they had planted together, and she thought about loneliness, which is not the same thing as being alone. She had been alone since her father died, and she had managed it. But lonely was a different thing, a thing she had not fully named until this moment when she was sitting beside someone who made it less so. "I have not had much practice with this sort of thing," she said carefully. "I have been busy." "I know," he said. "So have I. I am not easy to know," she said. I have opinions and I am stubborn and I do not pretend to feel things I do not feel or say things I do not mean. Those sound like advantages to me, he said. She looked at him sidelong. You are different from what I expected when I saw you riding up that first morning. What did you expect? Someone easier to dislike, she said. And this time when she almost smiled, it became a real smile, slow and warm and worth every single thing he had done to earn it. He leaned toward her, not far, just far enough to make the question clear, and she tilted her face toward him, just slightly, just enough to answer it. And in the warm spring dark on the porch of a Kansas farmhouse with the field they had planted together breathing quietly behind them, he kissed her for the first time, soft and unhurried and entirely certain. June came in with heat and a long, steady rain that was exactly what the corn needed, and the wheat that Winifred had planted the previous fall came to harvest golden and heavy-headed in the second week of the month. She sold it to the grain buyer in Larkspur for $83, which was $3 more than she had hoped for, and she put the money in the tin under the floorboard and let herself feel the satisfaction of it fully. Jedediah had moved into the farmhouse on his own 60-acre parcel and was working it with the focused energy of a man who has finally found the thing he was meant to be doing. He had repaired the old farmhouse on the property, which had been standing empty for 2 years, and had gotten a start on breaking the south field. He came to Winifred's place most evenings, and she came to his on Sunday afternoons, and between the two of them and Amos Decker, there was a small community of practical helpfulness and growing affection that felt to all three of them like the beginning of something solid. Consolidated Land and Grazing Company had indeed consulted their Dodge City lawyers, and the lawyers had come back with exactly the assessment Jedediah had predicted. The homestead grant proviso was valid and enforceable, and the cost of contesting it through the courts was likely to exceed any realistic return from the 40-acre parcel. The company's recommendation was to write off the lien as a bad debt and focus their acquisition efforts elsewhere. Garfield Prout delivered this news to the land office in Larkspur with the expression of a man eating something unpleasant, and Jedediah, who happened to be in town that day on other business, heard about it from the hotel clerk, who heard about it from the telegraph operator, which was the way news traveled in Larkspur in 1878. He rode to the Bancroft place that afternoon to tell her and found her standing in the cornfield, which was already knee-high and looking strong, with her hand resting on one of the stalks and her face turned up to the afternoon sun. She looked so entirely at peace in that moment that he pulled up his horse and waited until she heard him and turned, and the smile she gave him was the full open version, not the almost smile, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen since he had come to Kansas. Consolidated has abandoned the lien, he said. She stared at him. What? Their lawyers advised them it was not worth pursuing. The debt is forgiven. She stood very still for a moment, and then she sat down right there in the cornfield, sat down in the dirt between 2 rows of corn, and she put her face in her hands, and the sound she made was something between a laugh and a sob and was entirely private and entirely human. He got off his horse and walked to her and sat down beside her in the cornfield, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the dirt between the rows while she got her bearings, which did not take long because she was not a woman who stayed undone for long, but which she allowed herself entirely and without apology. "It is over," she said finally, and her voice was steady again. "It is over," he confirmed. She took a breath of warm cornfield air and lifted her head and looked at him, and she was herself again, clear-eyed and present. "Then we have nothing to worry about except the second crop," she said. "Nothing," he agreed, "and the fence on the west side that needs replacing." "I saw that," he said. "I can bring posts from the timber lot on my place. And the barn roof. There are 3 more shingles I have not replaced." "I can do that on Thursday," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You are making yourself very necessary," she said. He met her eyes. "That is entirely intentional," he said. He kissed her there in the cornfield, in the warm June afternoon, with the corn growing strong around them and the sky as blue as it ever gets over Kansas. And when she kissed him back, her hands came up to his face and held it the way you hold something you have decided you are keeping. The summer moved forward the way good summers do, generously, each day offering something that was worth having. The corn grew tall, and the second planting on Winifred's east field came in beautifully, responding to the repaired channel, and the good care she gave it with the kind of abundance that makes a farmer feel that the conversation her father had described is real, that the land hears you when you speak to it with honesty and effort. Jedediah's own land was shaping up, the south field producing a first cutting of hay that he sold to the livery, and to two of the cattle operations north of town for a solid return. He was not getting rich, but he was building something, and the building was the point. He had learned in his years of transacting land for consolidated that the men who bought land for profit and the men who worked land for life were different kinds of men, and he knew now without question which kind he was. He asked Winifred to marry him in August, not with any particular ceremony, but in the straightforward way that fit both of them. They were sitting on the creek bank in the evening, cooling their feet in the water after a long hot day, and he said, "Winifred, I would like to spend the rest of my life working this country alongside you. I would like to be your husband, if that is something you want." She was quiet for long enough that a blue heron that had been standing in the shallows 20 feet away finished its fishing and lifted heavily into the air and was gone. "Yes," she said, "it is something I want." He had a ring, a simple gold band he had bought from the jeweler in town the previous week because he had known then, though he had not yet said the words. He put it on her finger and she looked at it in the fading light, and her expression was the quiet kind of joy that does not need to shout itself. "I want you to understand something," she said. "This land is not mine to merge into yours or yours into mine. It is two separate pieces of property, and I intend to keep them separate even in marriage, because this land belonged to my father and to his father's dream, and I am the steward of that. That is not a negotiation. I would not ask you to do otherwise," he said. "What you have built here is yours. I want to add to it, not absorb it." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the creek and the darkening sky. "You are the right man," she said softly. "I want you to know that I know that." "You are the right woman," he said. "I have known that since the first morning." "Since the ditch," she said. "Since the ditch," he confirmed. They married in October 1878 in the church that doubled as the schoolhouse, in a ceremony performed by the Reverend Hiram Forsyth, who was a short, cheerful man with a beard that was mostly wishful thinking, but a genuine gift for the kind of ceremony that felt like a real occasion rather than a legal procedure. Amos Decker stood as witness for both of them, which he found deeply satisfying. The congregation was modest but warm. People from the surrounding farms and a few from the town who had come to know Jedediah in his months in Larkspur, and who had come to know Winifred as the woman who had fought to keep her land and won. She wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered and pressed and made right, a deep cream color with small blue flowers at the collar, and she walked down the aisle with her hands full of prairie wildflowers, goldenrod and aster and late-season sunflowers, because she was not a woman who did things the way you expected her to do them, and she had picked those flowers herself that morning from the edges of her own fields. When Jedediah saw her coming toward him, he felt something in his chest that rearranged things permanently and left him a different kind of man than he had been before. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but when the moment came, Jedediah added, quietly and off the paper, that he promised to work this land beside her honestly and to never stop listening to what she had to say. And Winifred added that she promised to feed him well and argue with him freely and trust him with the things that mattered, which made the congregation laugh and the Reverend Forsyth beam. After the ceremony, Amos Decker threw a celebration at his property that was the kind of thing the neighborhood had not seen in years, with a fiddle player from town and enough food from neighboring farms to suggest that the whole community had decided this wedding was a community occasion, which in a sense it was. There was dancing on the packed earth of the yard, and Jedediah danced with his wife in the lantern light, holding her with the tenderness of a man who knows the value of what he is holding. "Are you happy?" He asked her, not because he doubted it, but because he wanted to hear her say it. "I am happy," she said, and it was not a small thing coming from her. They worked the two farms as one operation in practical terms, though the two properties remained legally distinct as Winifred had asked, their borders meeting at the north edge of her east field and the south edge of his south pasture, which felt appropriate to both of them, like two hands joining without either losing its own shape. Through the fall and into the winter they put up stores, pickled and preserved and salted, and they repaired what needed repairing, and they made plans for the following year's planting with the same meticulous care that Winifred had always brought to her maps. Those maps had expanded to cover an entire wall of the farmhouse where they now lived together, Winifred's farmhouse, where Jedediah had moved his small number of possessions and his considerably larger number of opinions. He had added his own notations in a different hand, the two handwritings making a kind of conversation on the paper that somehow conveyed the whole story of how they had arrived at this life together. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was hard but manageable. They had put up enough, and they had each other, and the small house that had once felt too quiet to Winifred was full now in all the ways that mattered. They read to each other in the evenings by the oil lamp, taking turns with the small collection of books they had assembled between them, and they argued pleasantly about what they read and about the news from the paper and about farming philosophy, and when the arguments were done they were closer than they had been before them, which is the sign of the right kind of argument. In the first week of March 1879, Winifred told Jedediah that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen at the table where he had first drunk her coffee, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, something open and odd and younger than his usual expression, and he came around the table and held her for a long time without saying anything at all. "Well," she said eventually into his shoulder. "Well," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I expect the farming schedule will need some adjustment," she said. "I expect it will," he said, and there was a laugh underneath the words that was also something else, something full and profound and grateful. The spring of 1879 was the best planting season they had seen. The rains came right, and the warm came right, and the soil that Winifred had been tending and studying and improving for years responded with a generosity that felt like it was answering something. The wheat went in strong, and the corn that followed it came up even stronger. And by June, the fields on both properties were showing the kind of growth that makes you understand why people stayed in Kansas despite everything it could do to a person. Amos Decker, watching the crops from the road one afternoon in June, told Jedediah that he had not seen the Bancroft fields look that good since Thomas Bancroft's best years in the early 1870s. Jedediah passed this on to Winifred, who received it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been trying to say something to the earth for a long time and has finally been understood. She was showing clearly by July, and she had modified her working methods not without complaint, but with the practical adaptation that characterized everything she did, delegating the heaviest physical work to Jedediah and Amos, and focusing her own energy on the management and care and decision-making that she was better at than either of them anyway. Jedediah had hired a young man from town, a 16-year-old named Samuel Croft, who turned out to have both willingness and aptitude, and between the four of them the two properties ran well. The summer brought other things too. A family named Hargrove settled on the empty 40 acres south of Amos Decker's place, and their arrival brought new neighbors with two older daughters and a son who was Samuel Croft's age. And gradually, the small community that had been assembling around the two farms began to feel like a real neighborhood. the kind where people trade labor at harvest time and look in on each other when the weather turns. There was one afternoon in August when a consolidated land company representative came through Larkspur, a different man from Jedediah, a harder-edged man named Burrows who was looking at the grazing lands to the north of town, and who stopped at the land office and asked Garfield Prout about the Bancroft situation. Prout, who had undergone a modest transformation in his regard for Jedediah since the earlier business, told Burrows that the property was legally secure and actively worked, and that any further approach would be unwelcome and legally questionable. Burrows rode north the next morning, and the matter was closed. Jedediah heard about Burrows' visit from Amos and went to Prout's office to thank him, which surprised Prout considerably but which he received with gruff pleasure. "That is a good piece of land," Prout said, "and you have worked it well. It would be a shame to see it broken up." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the warmth of this statement. "The county is better for it. That is all I mean." In September, the wheat and corn harvests came in together, and they were the best harvests either property had seen since Winifred's father's peak years. When the grain buyer came and the accounts were settled, Winifred had enough not only to cover any remaining interest from the old consolidated debt, which was technically forgiven but which she intended to pay anyway for her own peace of mind, but also enough to put money aside for the following year's seed and for the improvements she had been planning. Jedediah's harvest added to this a comfortable surplus. They sat at the kitchen table that evening with the account spread before them, the two sets of figures from two properties that ran as one, and Jedediah looked at the numbers and then looked at his wife, who was 8 months along and entirely serene despite everything, and he said, "Your father would be proud." She was quiet for a moment. "I think he knew," she said. "He believed in this land past all reasonable sense, and I think he knew it would answer him eventually." She put her hand over her stomach. "He just did not know when or through whom." The baby came on the 6th of October, 1879, 1 year almost to the week from their wedding. He came in the early hours, when the stars were still up, and the air had that quality that it only has at 4 in the morning in October, cold and still and immensely patient. Dr. Lester Payne, who had been practicing medicine in Larkspur for 6 years, was there along with Mrs. Hargrove from the neighboring farm, who had midwifing experience and a calm competence that Winifred found reassuring. Jedediah paced the kitchen for 2 hours, which was not his nature but which he could not avoid, and when he heard the first sound of his child he stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, and felt something happen in his interior landscape that had no words available for it and did not need them. They named the boy Thomas Bancroft Whitfield, after Winifred's father, which was entirely her idea and which Jedediah thought was exactly right. He was a solid boy with dark hair, and in the first hours of his life, a disposition that suggested opinion and will, which given his parentage was not surprising. Amos Decker came by the next morning with a smoked ham and a look on his face that was pure, uncomplicated delight, and he stood over the cradle that Jedediah had made from timber off their own land, and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who has been hoping for something like this without knowing how to say so. "Thomas," he said. "Good name." "It is the right name," said Winifred from the bed, where she was resting with the authority of a woman who has earned her rest completely. The winter of 1879 to 1880 passed in the particular warm enclosure of a house with a new baby, the rhythms reorganized around small needs and large feelings, the long nights made companionable by the presence of the child and by the fire, and by the way that parenthood clarifies things, brings into sharp relief what matters and what does not. Jedediah, who had come to Larkspur as a stranger with a paper offer and a corporation behind him, found himself at 31 years old in possession of a life that fit him the way a well-made thing fits its purpose. He worked his land and he worked alongside Winifred on hers, and he helped his neighbors when they needed it and was helped in return. And in the evenings he was home, And home was a thing that had not always meant something to him, but meant everything now. Winifred healed quickly and was back at her planning tables by November, drawing out the rotation schedule for the following year, adding new notations to the maps that had grown to cover most of one kitchen wall, the record of everything she and her father and now Jedediah had learned about this land. She was nursing Thomas and thinking about crop rotation, and talking about the East Field's drainage with the same simultaneous attention to many things that she brought to everything. And Jedediah sat across from her with his own coffee, and watched her with the steady and particular happiness of a man who knows exactly where he is, and has decided it is precisely where he means to be. Spring 1880 came with a new energy that everyone in Larkspur seemed to feel. The town was growing. A second church had been organized. A doctor's office had been built separate from the hotel, and there was talk of a schoolhouse that would be dedicated to schooling rather than doubling as a church, which was the kind of civic ambition that meant a place was putting down roots. Jedediah was asked to serve on the town land committee, which oversaw the proper recording of property claims and the prevention of the kind of fraudulent land deals that had troubled the county in earlier years. He accepted because he understood the mechanisms of those frauds better than most, and because his history, having worked for a company like Consolidated, gave him a useful and somewhat chastened perspective. He told Winifred about the appointment one evening, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts amusement and respect. "A land buyer turned land protector," she said. "Something like that," he said. "You should do it," she said. "You are good at the details and you are honest, and those two things together are rarer than they should be." He served on the committee for 3 years. He was thorough and fair, and people trusted him, which was the most important thing. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that was not severe enough to destroy crops, but severe enough to test them. And the East Channel that Jedediah had helped Winifred repair in the spring of 1878 proved its worth absolutely. The underground water source that Winifred had identified in her maps, the one nobody had properly tapped, fed the channel steadily through the dry weeks when the surface water was scarce, and the Bancroft fields showed the only healthy standing corn in the immediate area when August came. Several of her neighbors came to look and to ask questions, and she answered them honestly and completely, as she did everything, because she did not believe in hoarding knowledge about things that could help people. By the fall of 1880, they had a 2-year-old boy who was walking and talking and forming opinions about everything, a thriving combined farm operation, a position in the community that was built on genuine respect, and a life that was full in the way that lives built from honest work and real love are full. That October, on their second anniversary, Jedediah came home from the South Field to find Winifred standing at the kitchen table with a look on her face that he had learned to read as meaning she had something to tell him. "Again?" he said. "Again," she said. He set down his hat and came to her and kissed her warmly. "When?" "April, I expect," she said. "Thomas will have a sibling," he said. "He will," she said. "He has been asking for one in his way." Thomas had in fact been asking by indicating other families' babies with great interest and patting Winifred's stomach speculatively, which she found both amusing and slightly alarming. "He is observant," Jedediah had said, "like his mother." The second child was a girl, born in early April 1881, during a week when the prairie was just beginning to come into its spring color, the green coming back into the pastures and the first wildflowers appearing along the creek. They named her Clara Me Whitfield, Clara for no particular reason except that it suited her, and Me for Winifred's mother, whose name had been Mary, and who had gone by Me among those who loved her. Clara was born sunny-natured and remained so, which was a thing that seemed remarkable given the general intensity of both her parents. And Jedediah said she must have gotten it from some third party because it was not immediately traceable to either of them, which made Winifred laugh. The maps on the kitchen wall had been supplemented by 1881 by a second set of maps that included both properties, cross-referenced and notated, and continuously updated. A living document of everything they had learned about the soil and the water and the seasons of this particular piece of the Kansas prairie. Winifred had begun writing down her observations in a journal as well, a practice she had started after the drought of 1880, when she wanted to record exactly how the underground water source had behaved. And this journal was filling up with the kind of practical agricultural wisdom that comes only from sustained and attentive engagement with a specific piece of land over a long period of time. Jedediah had built a proper study off the kitchen during the winter of 1880 to 1881, a room with shelves and a good writing table, where Winifred could work on her journals and planning without doing so in the same room where Thomas was eating his supper and forming opinions about it. She had protested slightly that she did not need a study, and he had said that she did and built it anyway. And when it was done, she stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves and the window that faced the east field and said, "You are still making yourself necessary." "Still intentional," he said. She turned and kissed him, which was better than thanking him. In the spring of 1882, Samuel Croft, who had grown from a 16-year-old helping hand into a capable young man of 20, told Jedediah that he had saved enough money to think about a land claim of his own and asked for Jedediah's advice. They spent several evenings going over the available parcels and the terms of the Homestead Act and the practical considerations of starting a farm, and Jedediah gave him advice that was informed by everything he had learned, both from his years at Consolidated and from his years working the land himself. Samuel took out a claim on 30 acres east of the Hargrove property and began building his own story. That same spring, Amos Decker, who was getting on in years and whose joints troubled him in the cold weather, began talking about the future of his property. He had no children and no near family, and the question of the land was one he thought about with increasing frequency. He came to talk to Jedediah and Winifred about it one April evening, sitting at their kitchen table with little Thomas climbing on the chair beside him and Clara asleep in her cradle near the stove, and he laid out what he had been thinking. He wanted the land to go to someone who would work it properly, he said, not to a company and not to a speculator, but to a farming family who understood what land was for. He had made his decision. He wanted to sell to Jedediah and Winifred at a fair price that accounted for his own need for a modest income in his remaining years, with a right of continued residence in the farmhouse for as long as he lived. The conversation was long and careful and entirely mutual. By the end of the evening, they had the outlines of an arrangement that suited everyone, a purchase price that Jedediah could meet from his reserves and the last 2 years' farm profits, a monthly payment to Amos for the remainder of his life, and the understanding that he would always have his home and his place at their table. Amos Decker lived for 7 more years in that farmhouse, and in those 7 years he became in all practical ways the grandfather that Thomas and Clara would not otherwise have had. He taught Thomas to fish in the creek and told him stories about the early days of the territory, and passed on to him the particular quality of attention to the natural world that comes from a life spent watching it closely. He was there for every harvest and every crisis and every celebration, and when he died in 1889, it was in his own bed in his own house with Winifred and Jedediah beside him, and the 2 children grown enough to understand what was being lost and to be grateful for what had been given. But that was years away. In the spring of 1882, the Bancroft Whitfield farm, as it had come to be known informally in the county, now comprised 3 properties running to a total of 170 acres of some of the best-worked soil in Barton County, and it was tended by 2 people who had come to each other across the specific distance of a land transaction, and had found in that crossing something that neither of them had expected to find. The corn that year was extraordinary. Winifred had implemented a new rotation that she had been planning for 2 years, informed by her journals and her maps, and the conversations she had with the land through 20-odd years of looking and listening. And the East Field responded the way she had predicted it would, with a yield that put every neighboring property in the shade. When the grain buyer came and offered his assessment, he took his hat off to her, and she accepted this with the quiet certainty of someone who has known all along what the land could do. Jedediah stood at the edge of the East Field in the early evening of harvest day and looked at it all, the cut wheat lying in rows, the corn standing tall in the adjacent section, the channel running clear and full at the field's edge, the farmhouse with its lights coming on as the dark came down, the sound of his children inside, and he thought about the morning he had ridden across this same ground looking for a woman to sign a paper. He thought about a woman in a ditch in the gray light. He thought about the long distance between that moment and this one, and all the turnings in the road, and how almost none of it had gone the way he had planned, and how entirely right that was. Winifred came out of the house and walked to the field edge and stood beside him, and she put her hand in his hand, and they stood together looking at the land they had made together from the raw material of a last desperate acre and a man who had changed his mind about what he was there to do. "I have been thinking," she said. "About the spring rotation," he asked. "About the spring rotation," she confirmed. "And also about something else." "What else?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I have been thinking about the fact that you came here to buy this land and instead you planted it." He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" She squeezed his hand. "It is the thing I am most grateful for in my life," she said. The stars were coming out, the great sweep of them over the Kansas prairie, and the cottonwood by the creek was murmuring in a small wind. And somewhere in the house Thomas was arguing with Clara about something with the passionate illogic of children, and the lamp in the kitchen window made a warm square of light in the dark. And Jedediah Whitfield, who had once ridden across this land with a corporate paper in his pocket and an intent to purchase, stood in the field he had helped plant and held his wife's hand and knew himself to be precisely where he was supposed to be, doing precisely what he was supposed to be doing, with precisely the person he was supposed to be doing it with, which is a state of grace that most people spend their whole lives looking for. "Come inside," Winifred said. "Supper is getting cold." "In a minute," he said. He turned and looked at her fully. This woman who had stood in a ditch before sunrise and told a stranger from a land company that her land was not for sale, who had made maps of her father's dream and worked it alone and refused to be moved, who had let him sit at her table and drink her coffee and come back day after day, and who had finally, in the way she did things, simply and without fanfare and entirely sincerely, let him in. He kissed her there at the edge of the field they had planted together, his wife of nearly 4 years, the mother of his children, the keeper of the best 40 acres in Barton County, and she kissed him back with the ease of long practice and new feeling, because love that is real does not diminish with familiarity but deepens with it. "Inside," she said against his mouth, and she was almost smiling, which was the same as laughing, coming from her. "Inside," he agreed, and they walked together back to the house. The years that followed were good years in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ordinary reversals and repairs that constitute a life lived with eyes open, but good in the essential way, rooted and growing, the two of them facing each season together and teaching their children by example what it meant to be committed to a place and to each other. They added to the farm carefully, never overextending, always keeping the land's health ahead of the profit margin, and the land repaid them in the way that Winifred's father had always believed it would, generously and in its own time. Thomas grew into a young man who had his mother's feel for the land and his father's steadiness, and by the time he was in his early teens, he was already an indispensable part of the farm's operation, moving through the fields with the unself-conscious competence of someone who has grown up in a working landscape. Clara, who had inherited her sunny nature intact into adolescence, turned out also to have a sharp practical intelligence that expressed itself in the management of the farm's accounts, which she had taken over from her mother by the age of 14, with a facility that made both parents laugh with surprised pride. On an evening in the late summer of 1885, Winifred sat at her study desk and wrote in her journal, which had grown by then to fill 3 volumes and was already something more than a private record, something like a manual for farming this specific piece of ground that she knew she would eventually pass on to her children the way her father had passed the land itself to her. She wrote, "The East Channel has run clear for 7 years without a serious failure. The underground source is dependable. The rotation works. The corn yields are consistent and the wheat continues strong. The land is healthy. The children are healthy. My husband is in the south field right now, fixing a fence post that went over in last week's wind, and I can hear him from here, talking to Thomas while they work, and the sound of that is the best sound I know." She set down her pen and looked out the window at the east field, which was golden with the last of the summer light, and she thought about her father, who had believed in this land past all reasonable sense, and she thought about how she had stood in a ditch one gray morning and watched a man ride toward her and felt the particular tightening that means something is about to change, and how everything that had followed from that moment had been, in ways she could not have predicted and would not have arranged, entirely right. She picked up her pen again and wrote one more line. "He came to buy the last acre and left having planted the field instead, and in doing so planted everything else that matters, and I am grateful, and the land is grateful, and the story is not finished." She closed the journal and put it on the shelf between the first 2 volumes and went to the kitchen to start supper for her family, who would be coming in from the fields as the light went. Her husband and her son and her daughter, hungry and tired and alive, in the particular way that people who work the land are alive, fully and without reservation, the way the land itself is alive, which is permanently and beyond all reasonable doubt. Outside, the cottonwood by the creek bent in a small evening wind, and the water ran clear and steady in the East Channel, and the corn stood tall in the last light, and the Kansas sky did what it always did at the end of a summer day, offered itself up in all its extravagance, orange and pink and deep violet, as if it were trying to say something about how the things you tend will answer you, and how the things you love will grow, and how a man who came to buy the last acre of a woman's inheritance left instead having planted her field, and stayed and built, and became in the fullness of time not the end of a story but the beginning of one that was still, all these years later and all these seasons later, in the best and most generous sense of the word, growing.